Chapter 2 Promises. Vancouver, Canada, Earth, 4 days after longboat FTL jump. Fidgeting on the stage, Lincoln crossed her arms, and then feeling that it was awkward with all the eyes of the crowd on her, uncrossed them again. "I swear you were more nervous during the flight," said Malcolm, leaning over to his seat on the stage next to her. "I don't see the point of all this pomp. We need to work on refining the equations for the FTL systems. With all the data that we gather in subspace, we should be able to drastically reduce the amount of strange matter and antimatter needed to go into FTL. Heck, if my calculations for optimization are correct, you could fly to Epsilon Eridani in a day and have enough fuel to make it back," said Lincoln excitedly. Malcolm continued to nod along with the woman as he continued to speak, going on about how, with a few structural modifications to modern battleships, any ship in the combined fleets of humanity would be able to make an FTL jump. When he had first met the scientist, he had found her inability to shut up rather annoying, but had quickly discovered that it was her way to deal with stress. Up on a stage with a crowd of thousands in front of her, and the eyes of millions all around the Sol system focused on her, as well as everyone else on the stage, the scientist had plenty of reasons to be nervous. Shifting in his chair, Malcolm winced. The nanomachines were working overtime to try and eliminate the pain in his joints and bone structure. He was a Martian through and through, and despite being in the best shape of his life, the full 1G of Earth was something he didn't think he would ever be comfortable. Most Martians on Earth wore the synthetic muscles that were a part of the standard battle armor setup. But up on stage, for a formal event and wearing his stuffy dress uniform, Malcolm had to forego the synthetic assistance. It didn't fit under his synthetic muscle layers. "So you think they'll go for it?" asked Lincoln, her direct question cutting into his thoughts. "Or?" asked Malcolm as he tried to backtrack in the conversation he had been ignoring. "The construction of more ships, ones built specifically for FTL, to explore." Malcolm chuckled and shook his head. "No, this was a political stunt, Doc, you know that. Besides, we used up all the antimatter and fairly certain that the new treaty forbids everyone from making more. You'll be lucky to see the next FTL flight." Lincoln's face visibly fell. "All of those plans were before we knew it was possible. You don't think the governments will want to try now that we know it's possible?" The largest point of contention that sparked the war was Martian independence. How much worse would the war have been if it were between star systems and dozens of planets? "It's not politically advantageous for either planet to suggest expanding right now. Heck, most of the territory in Mars is still untouched. We still have plenty of room to expand." Lincoln slowly nodded, understanding but not convinced. "We stagnated under that kind of thinking, that we had to solve all the issues here before we would be able to expand to the stars. It took a half-dozen people who were by all definitions insane to start the Martian colonization process." Malcolm considered her words, and unconcerned with the crowd watching them as everything for the ceremony was set up, he leaned back into his seat. "True, but at the moment humanity is tired. We're tired of living in the now. Don't you want to explore the stars? Fly around a black hole or a red supergiant? Dive a jet through an atmosphere so thick with hydrogen you would never have to touch the ground again? I would think an old pilot like you would dream of doing something like that." "Old?" asked Malcolm, raising his eyebrows at the scientist. She shrugged and Malcolm let it slide. Perhaps he was old. The woman next to him had something in her eyes he had once seen in his own. An excited glee not unlike that of a child. For a moment he wished he could feel like that again, but the war had taken that. Not that Malcolm could admonish her for the naivety. It was something he desperately wished he could have maintained. Lincoln had, according to Martian intelligence reports, served as a tactical statistician and had single-handedly written many of the trajectory algorithms Earth had used to calculate weapons bombardment over millions of kilometers of open space. But the woman had never had to directly take a life. The two were delayed any further conversation. As the president stepped up onto the stage, the crowd which had been producing the low steady rumble of conversation died down and quite fell over the field. Malcolm looked the man over. He was the standard political type, his suit impeccable and his grin as fake as anything else. Still, he was a better man than the idiotic president who had started the war. This man, elected in the wake of the peace accords, was a new element looking to gain prestige in the post-war power vacuum. The president waved his hand and a cheer rang up from the massive crowd. Mars and Earth. Together we have achieved what was once thought impossible. We have proven that Mars and Earth can achieve anything. In this first of many successful projects between Earth and Mars, we have bent the very rules of reality itself to our whim. Imagine a future where together we can say nothing is impossible. A cheer rang up from the crowd, and Malcolm felt a shiver go through his spine. The sound, the intensity behind it was almost primal. These were not planted actors in the crowd, cheering like so often at these rallies. These were real people. Sitting up a little straighter in his seat, ignoring the pain in his joints, the president was pedantic and annoying for the most part, but the energy of the people was infectious. A Terran and a Martian working together and braving the dangers of the unknown. This is something that we should all strive to emulate as we work to rebuild both of our worlds. A future where both Earth and Mars can benefit and learn from one another. The president raised his fist and the crowd again cheered. The president's speech continued, drifting away from the actual accomplishments of the FTL travel, instead focusing on the cooperation and peace between Earth and Mars. It drifted away from what the single FTL jump represented to the scientists on both sides who had dreamed of it, the engineers from both worlds who had built it, and the dreamers like Lincoln who saw it as the next step for humanity, the stepping stone that humanity needed. Malcolm stood. The president continued on for several moments before noticing and turning to see Malcolm behind him, a small grin on his face. For a moment the politician froze, but experienced enough to not make a face, took the interruption to his well-rehearsed speech in stride. Malcolm stepped forwards and the president turned back to the crowd. Now a few words from the brave pilot of Longboard 4, Lieutenant James Malcolm. The president stepped away from his podium while shooting Malcolm a brief frown, turned back to the crowd and suddenly smiling again went and sat down next to Lincoln. For a moment Malcolm was frozen. He had worked himself up to doing this in half a second. Now with billions of eyes on him he was nervous. Still, if only a few of the people in the crowd, a few behind the lenses of the camera watching through the solar system listened, it would be worth it. This is not an accomplishment between Earth and Mars, rather this is an accomplishment for humanity. Since the dawn of our race we have dreamed of the stars. At first we saw them as holes in the curtain of night, until we noticed that a few of those small pinpricks of light were dancing across the heavens. Mars was once a star, to the very people who had only their eyes to gaze upon the heavens. Now millions live on that old star. Malcolm paused and glanced back at Lincoln. The woman's mouth was open in astonishment of his little impromptu speech. Millions of people live on that star because humanity needed to conquer it. Mars was our first stumbling step into the universe. Like always, we fought over that step. History is nothing if not full of examples showing that man is always ready for war. So let us go to war, not with ourselves but with the greatest enemy, the stars and the universe herself. We cannot become stagnant once more, restricted and limited to 2 planets. Malcolm took a breath and sorted out his next words. The crowd was silent. If it was in horror, apathy or astonishment, Malcolm wasn't sure. At this point though he wasn't going to stop. I will not rest until humanity has conquered another star in the heavens above, and we should not as a people pause until we have explored all that the universe can offer to us. Humanity has fallen, stumbled. We have made our first real step into the universe, and although we will stumble again in the future, we have moved forwards. To stop now would be an insult to all of those who came before us, to all of those who died in sacrifice to correct our errors. We are not Terrans and Martians working to fix our broken worlds. We are humanity reaching up to conquer the heavens. Taking a step back from the podium, Malcolm raised an open hand to the sky in a gesture that would never be forgotten, pledging to conquer the stars themselves. The crowd was silent for a half-beat before a loud rumble overtook it. The shouting and stomping of feet that followed the declaration was so loud that no one heard it. The single sound that solidified the vow and transformed the impromptu speech into the pledge of a martyr. Malcolm hardly felt it at first, a slight pinch in his chest. He was running off of adrenaline and the emotions of the crowd around him. The pain began to grow, and for a moment Malcolm wondered if something had finally broken in the hellish gravity of Earth. The pain in his chest increasing, Malcolm finally looked down at his chest. Malcolm was for a moment confused by the dark stain quickly working its way across his dark navy blue uniform. Lincoln was staring not at the sky, but at Malcolm as he finished his speech. She saw the dark stain even before he did. Looking back on videos of the incident, she would wince at the sound of her own scream in the heat of the moment, although she didn't even register that she was screaming. Her shout was picked up by those in the front rows of the crowd, though, and in an instant the shouts of triumphant jubilation turned into screams of terror. The trained bodyguards were the first ones to react. Moving across the stage, they tackled and protected the VIPs on the platform. The crowd was next, reacting almost as one. The masses of humanity spotted the man holding the literal smoking gun and pounced on him like antibodies attacking a virus. Lincoln stumbled forwards and collapsed next to Malcolm. The image of the Terran mathematician cradling the Martian pilot in her lap, weeping, would be an image almost as famous as the one before it. The Terran and the Martian were both only human. One dreamed of the stars and the other had only wanted to make the woman he was falling for happy. The two stared into one another's eyes, even as Malcolm struggled to keep his own eyes open. Don't let the dream fade. Don't let anyone take it away from you. Vancouver, Canada, 4 days after longboat FTL jump. Lincoln slowly turned to look up at the general. The man was tall, and his skin, like most Martians, was pale and almost sickly looking due to lack of sunlight. Even in what for him had to be a harsh amount of gravity, he stood strong. Did he make it? Asked Lincoln, already knowing the answer to the question. The general sat down in the chair next to the woman, not showing any concern for the fact that she was still covered in the blood of her partner. The blood was not his main concern. No, it was the look in the woman's eyes. She was close to snapping. He didn't. The bullet was coated in nanomachine inhibitors. His brain was cut off from oxygen for far too long. Technically he's alive and they have him on life support, but he's brain dead. Lincoln leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. It took her only a moment to process it before she opened her eyes and stood. The general stood as well and placed his hand on the shorter woman's shoulder. We caught the man, or rather the crowd did. He's under heavy guard in the intensive care unit. The crowd almost finished administering mob justice before we could pull him away. What information do you have on his motives? He was part of a now defunct pro-Terran organisation. His son was killed in a bombing raid that the lieutenant performed during the war. Lincoln nodded. Can I see him? The lieutenant is in room 205. The general moved back towards the room, pointing in the direction of it. Not Malcolm. He's dead. I want to see the man who shot him. It took the general a moment to process that. Lincoln was speaking with only the barest hint of emotion. Her eyes, though, were ablaze with cold fury. I'm not sure that's a good idea. This is enough of a political mess as it is. Why do you want to see him? To make sure he succumbs to his injuries. The general raised an eyebrow at that. The woman had, to his knowledge, never directly taken a life. Still, she knew what her calculations were used for during the war. As much as you and I might think he deserves death, he still has to have his day in court. Lincoln looked at the military man for a moment, a rueful smile on her face. It's not worth it, General. This man's life is only increasing the tensions between Earth and Mars. If we remove him, then we don't waste any more time. Without his interference and that of his supporters, we'll be able to get to work. Get to work on what? What Malcolm promised out there on that stage, the stars themselves. The general paused. The look in the woman's eyes was displaying something that even if he found frightening after living through the horrors of the war. She was praised as one of the most talented mathematicians in the solar system. She had calculated how to break the laws of the universe itself and had been confident enough in them to risk her own life. To her, everything was a calculation. She already had the result in mind. All she needed to do was manipulate the equation and match the result. Putting her mind to it, she was not the type of person who allowed failure. To her, failure simply didn't exist. He's in room 406. Thank you. Miss Lincoln, if you want to ensure that the lieutenant's sacrifice was not in vain, you will need help. Are you offering me your support, General? The politicians on both sides were stagnant and concerned only with the known quantities and issues. Neither side, Earth or Mars, wanted to move forwards past the unsteady peace of the now. The politicians had such a delicate grip on power for the first time in hundreds of years that none could do anything but follow the party lines, and propaganda or fear, losing the little influence they had. The The general thought back to the sound of the crowd before the sound of the gun, the primal sound of the people in the masses. Humanity was poised to spread throughout the heavens, and they would not be denied. I suppose I am. Empire scout ship, unknown location, 4 days after longboat FTL jump. Charles opened the communication channel and sat down at his workstation. The image of an annoyed high scientist appeared on the holographic pad in front of him, complete with a desk with hundreds of data pads and components on it. "What is it?" growled the man, barely looking up from the mess. "I need an analysis of a Class C species moved to the front of the queue. My team is unable to make any further headway on the analysis. This needs to be done quickly." The high scientist sighed and looked up into the communication terminal, clearly annoyed. "The analysis of Class C species is done by apprentices. Are you trying to insult me? This is a case unique enough that I believe it warrants your full attention. To hand it off the data to an apprentice and not directly to you would be the insult." The high scientist looked skeptical, but waved his hand, and Charles quickly transmitted the data to the man. Looking at the data for several moments as it streamed into the terminal in front of him, the scientist looked bored for several moments, and then his eyes widened. Leaning forward, knocking several things off of his desk, the man grabbed at the terminal and pulled it closer to his eyes. Charles remained silent and let the man try to absorb the data. As disturbing as it was to think a Class C species might have FTL, the fact that they had discovered some other means to access subspace was amazing. After several minutes, the man leaned back in his chair and, reaching up, wiped off his brow. "This is insane." Charles nodded in agreement. "It is. What I just sent you is the preliminary data. I flagged all of my data as high as my authority allows it, but still it is going to take months to process it. If you were to flag it, the data would be on the council's desk tomorrow." The high scientist looked down at the data again for a moment and, leaning forwards, quickly typed something into his terminal. "Done." Charles blinked. "Just like that, sir. This data shows a Class C species not only developing FTL, but a method of FTL unlike our own. Tell me, did you see what is missing from the data?" "What is missing, sir?" "What do our ships need to make an FTL jump, Captain?" "A tachyon drive and a beacon to jump towards," said Charles, reciting technical jargon that had been memorized since he was a child. "And according to the data from this jump, this Class C species has developed a method of FTL without need of the beacons." Charles almost opened his mouth to argue that such a thing was impossible, but then glanced back down at the data. "This is bad." "I agree. If they are not limited to the beacon network, this species could become a threat to the Empire on a level never before seen. They could travel to another galaxy for all we know." The high scientist stood. "I want all of your data now. When you get into orbit of the home world, you'll have clearance to land at the palace. This needs to be discussed in the presence of the Emperor." Charles felt his face drain of colour. He was going to get to meet the Emperor and tell the man his empire was facing perhaps the greatest threat since unification. That would go over well.